It's finally Friday. It's Friday, Friday.
Thank God it's
All right, welcome back to the Friday show, presented by NYRA Bets. When you sign up, bet 200, get 200. I'm Scott Jagow, along with Ray Paulick. We're glad to have you with us. Coming up, we'll revisit some of the great jockey fights of all time. But first, Ray, I wrote a series this week on speed figure makers, something that came out of a conversation you had a couple of months ago after the Arlington Million Day. Let's start with that. Tell us the story of that.
Jerry Crawford of Donegal contacted me. He owns Carrick, the winner of the Secretariat, and who won the race in a faster time than Robert Bruce, the winner of the Arlington Million at the same distance. And Jerry was just wondering, how could one speed figure purveyor put a higher number on Robert Bruce and another one put a higher number on Carrick? And so I said, Scott, why don't you try to figure this out? And instead of just answering that one question, you said, well, let's look at kind of what everybody's doing and compare and contrast. And, you know, I think it's something that really was long overdue. To me, there's a lot of smart people involved in putting these numbers in. I don't think there's a right or wrong number. They all take little different approaches to it. I go back to when Andy Beyer wrote Picking Winners and laid out his thing. That was the only thing available at the time, to my knowledge. But now there's a lot of choices.
There are a lot of choices, and I learned in doing these series, as you said, there's so many different little facets to it that can add up to different numbers for the same horse. In this case, with Carrick versus Robert Bruce, which I carried throughout the series, 4 out of the 6 figure makers that I talked to gave Robert Bruce the higher figure, despite the slower time, and 2 others gave Carrick the higher figure. Again, the pace of the race was slower in the Arlington Million, and that contributed to a final time that might be short of what you would expect for that class of horse. And some of the figure makers incorporated that into their equation. Now, what I found really interesting in the last piece is that the 2 computer modeling companies, Equibase and Brisnet, they both came out with opposite conclusions. One said Carrick was faster, one said Robert Bruce was faster. And I guess the conclusion that I came to as a handicapper is these are all really good tools that come at it from different angles. And I'm not saying you want to spend all the money to invest on their products every weekend, but I'm telling you, at the Breeders' Cup or some big events like that, it would behoove you to look at all the various options and see if they're all drawing the same conclusion on a particular horse. That might be a good bet.
Yeah, one of the things I found really interesting that there's maybe not 100% agreement on, but pretty good agreement, is that it's not a number is not the be all and end all. Andy Beyer said that, you know, it's not. This is kind of a starting point. You know, you use the number as a factor into other handicapping things. Same with Ed DeRosa at Brisnet. He said, you know, this is what I start with, and then you look at trips, you look at trouble, you look at other things. Now, the sheets and Thorograph do take some of those other things into account in terms of how wide a horse goes, what the conditions were, and all that. So, you know, a number is just a number. It's a big part of handicapping, but it's not the only part.
Yeah, I was impressed, you know, for example, talking to Jerry Brown at Thorograph. I mean, if you look back over the history of the company and some of the things that he has written about or gave presentations about, I mean, he's really into the science of why tracks change or how tracks change. You know, is there shade over this portion of the track during this portion of the day? What happens when you go from day to night? What happens when you water the track when it's sunny out versus watering the track when it's windy out? 2 totally different situations will occur there. And, you know, you don't have to know all that stuff, but you have to, you know, what he does is he is able to incorporate some of the results of it in the variant, which I think creates a pretty accurate picture of, you know, what happened on this day versus what happened on that day. So it's really fascinating. You can go down a lot of rabbit holes.
Yeah, one thing I learned in the series is I have not been a big proponent or user of the Equibase numbers, frankly, because I'm old school. I use daily racing form past performances. I look at Beyer. When I'm on a Del Mar all season, I sit with a guy who uses Brisnet figures, and he's always, you know, he's handicapping. He says, "What kind of a number did Beyer give it?" And he factors that into it. But I will say this, at least at Del Mar, when I also sit with a guy that uses the Thorograph, and there are a lot of times where the Thorograph top horse literally moves the odds on a race. You can almost predict when they have a horse as their top pick, and it's a big number, 10 to 1 or something. You can almost guarantee that horse is going to be bet down.
Well, they
do move the needle.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of big players in the industry who like the sheets and Thorograph because they're, you know, as I labeled them, other people label them designer figures, where there are more factors going in. Now, they're not cheap, and that's part of this equation. You do need to invest a little money if you're going to get that quality of a speed figure, but you know, it's probably worth it, as I said, especially for big events like the Breeders' Cup, to invest a little money. And even when I don't do that, I love looking at a couple of figures to just compare Brisnet versus Beyer to see, you know, if there's a significant difference. And as Ed DeRosa pointed out, you know, you got to look at the price of the horse as well. It might be worth saying, hey, let's take a roll on Brisnet on this case. Maybe it's Beyer in this case, where you go, that's a big discrepancy, and the price is 10 to 1. Let's go in on that.
Yeah, you know, I mentioned I don't use the Equibase number because I just don't usually have a track program that has it in there. But I'm impressed by what they've done with it, and you know, they've got a handicapper that really uses that number to his advantage, and he's picked out some pretty good winners. He's been putting stuff in the Paulick Report on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, Ellis Starr has been well with those Equibase speed figures, and I think in this day and age, in 2018, you have to consider the possibility that an algorithm generated by a computer can get pretty accurate. You know, the amount of data that Equibase has at its fingertips and can put into creating these numbers is unbelievable. You know, I think you can rely on Equibase speed figures in this day and age because the technology is so advanced in what you can do with it.
I'm reminded that Watson, the IBM computer, turned into a pretty good chess player against the greatest chess player on earth. So computers can do great things. You know, Equibase is probably that, and the Beyer speed figures are probably the most widely distributed.
Yeah.
Beyer being in the racing form and Equibase and track programs. But I think the Equibase number is probably the least appreciated.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, but perhaps this series will shed light on that differently. Okay, we have a poll on our website about this. Just a simple question: what speed figure maker do you prefer or usually use? Take the poll on our website, paulickreport.com. Okay, Ray, we had another jockey fight. I mean, this is a competitive business. This one went viral. Will Rogers Downs. It's not the first time we've had a fight at Will Rogers Downs. Has there been any fallout of this?
Well, the last fight at Will Rogers Downs was on horseback, so at least this time the jockeys waited to get back in the jocks room. Omar Reyes and James Flores got into it September 30th. Usually, you know, jockey room fights happen, not all the time, but they're not that unusual. What's unusual here is that somebody had their phone and caught it and put it up on the internet. Someone else picked it up. It got spread on Twitter and Facebook. And the last time I looked, there was something like 250,000 views. So it's not quite up there with Conor McGregor and Floyd Mayweather. Might have been a better fight, actually.
Yeah, I think you might be right on that one. You know, it's not up there in terms of viewership when it breaks out, you know, at the Breeders' Cup, as it did between Calvin Burrell and Javier Castellano. I got another story that maybe, you know, a lot of people haven't heard from Julie Crone. She told me this on the Around the Track podcast. Back a long time ago, she was at Monmouth Park, and she got into a fight with a male jockey. Well, it started with him hitting her with his whip. Then the next day, she gave him a sucker punch in the winner's circle or someplace, and they got into a scuffle. And then later, he waited for her, and he attacked her, pushing her into the swimming pool at Monmouth Park that existed at that time, and tried to drown her. She was recalling all of this while laughing, by the way.
That kind of leaves me speechless. There's a lot of emotions out on the racetrack. Sometimes it spills over into the jocks room. It is, after all, I think that one of the only sports where they compete against each other and then they go back into the same locker room and have to cool off. So sometimes it's better to let the cooler heads prevail. But next time maybe just put the camera down and let them just fight it out. Yeah,
don't get in the middle of it either, because that can cause more problems. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Friday Show, presented by NYRA Bets. When you sign up, you bet 200, you get 200. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.